I want to start this video with an exercise. Imagine, if you will, that you are a mangaka, with just a year shy of a decade of experience in the medium, with 5 of them being since your proper series debut. You've made a decent name for yourself, you've written a couple of short manga that did well, one of them is even going to be adapted into a movie. And after all of this, you finally reach the point where you want to try to write something bigger, something longer, and what comes out is not just a good manga. Instead, you write the thing that your name will be forever associated with, a manga that will be called your magnum opus, a manga that a lot of people will put among their favorite manga of all time. Now, my question is, once you're done with that, once you finish writing a manga that's going to make you one of the most recognized manga artists of the century, a manga that's going to overshadow your own name, a manga that is so incredibly acclaimed that many people don't believe has been surpassed. Once you are done with that, once you've achieved the thing that most mangaka want to do but are destined to fail at, where do you go from there? That's the position and probably the question on Inio Asano's mind in early 2014, after he had just finished Goodnight Punpun and was working on his next work. And today that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. We are going to analyze Dead Demons in the lenses of a follow-up of Punpun. We're going to be looking at which parts are sequels to it and what parts are direct opposites. But I think before we fully do that, we need to take some time to even understand Asano's stylistic evolution and how that led to Punpun. So let's leave that pin in 2014 and time travel back 15 years, all the way back to 1998. Now, we do know what kind of manga Asano was writing before it officially got published from interviews, and it seems like he was mostly doing absurd 4-koma gag manga. Now, while we don't have too much to go on by, we do have some images of his very first one-shot published again in 1998, which seems to be a very bizarre 4-koma gag manga. If you want to see Asano's dabble in this original style, I'd definitely recommend checking out Ozanari-kun, as that's definitely Asano toying with the most absurd comedy style he can do. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because while we definitely see bizarre, wacky, and absurd comedy pop in Asano's manga later on, at this point in his career, Asano isn't really dabbling with coming-of-age or drama stories, which is what most people probably associate with each and every single one of Asano's works. And to me, that's very interesting, because while that's not something that Asano seems to be writing in this very early stage in his life, there are 2 mangaka whose names come up when talking about Asano between his 1998 one-shot debut and his 2002 series debut, and both of them are arguably doing a lot of the things that Asano would eventually do, those 2 names being Naoki Yamamoto and Shin Takahashi. And we don't really know if Yamamoto had any actual influence on Asano. We know that Asano's first editor was also Yamamoto's one, and we know that Asano had Yamamoto manga in his office, but I do know that Yamamoto is probably the only writer who has written a manga that's devastated me more than Punpun with Harigato. So I definitely can see him having been an influence. But Shin Takahashi may be a bigger influence because prior to Asano's series debut, he worked as an assistant of Takahashi in his manga Saikano. And to be clear, I don't like Saikano. I could do a whole video on why I don't if there's people interested in that, but I do have to admit that there are clear elements of later Asano in Saikano. Saikano is a manga that blends the coming-of-age story and tragic romance with sci-fi and war elements, which already feels a lot like Dead Demons, but it also includes heavy usage of themes of sexual frustration, just like Asano does in a decent chunk of his works. So when we get to 2002 and we have a proper manga in What a Wonderful World, the surreal gag elements that define pre-debut Asano are nowhere to be seen. Instead, we have a short connected stories of teens and young adults just trying to live their lives in the world, fighting to fight reasons to live and find happiness. Well, I do think this manga is among Asano's weakest nowadays, as I think everything that the manga does well, there are others in his repertoire that do it better. What a Wonderful World does have one of my favorite panels in all of his manga, which should be on screen right now. The reason why I love this one so much is because it really encapsulates Asano's manga. These characters may be melodramatic, these characters may jump to monologues about the pain of living and depression, and suicide is definitely almost always a theme, but at the end of the day, there is hope in Asano's stories. There's always a light at the end of the tunnel, for the most part, but we'll get there in a little while. For now, this manga is a proper showcase of what Asano will do in the future. Again, melodramatic stories, characters going on deep rants about society, a lot of intertwined characters and stories, and mostly being relatively short, which is what Asano does most. And of course, some elements of his more surreal side popping here and there. Visually, we can see his style emerging. It's very important to note that What a Wonderful World saw Asano's first doing digital drawings, which he's going to implement often and innovate a lot later on. One last visual thing that I want to point out here is that on an interview, Asano admitted that before What a Wonderful World, one of the very few articles about him online mentioned how he sucked at backgrounds. So he decided to steal a technique from Osamu Furuya and trace real pictures of the backgrounds. It's not perfect yet. It honestly kinda bugs me how much more realistic the sky is compared to everything else, but we are going to see it slowly morph into one of Asano's most visually stunning characteristics as we move on. But for now, we move on. Following his debut, Inio Asano wrote two other notable manga, Nijigahara Holograph in 2003 and City of Lights in 2004. And while Nijigahara Holograph is his next work, for now I want to skip directly into City of Lights, because I think it goes back to a lot of elements of What a Wonderful World. The formula here is very much the same, short stories featuring multiple characters that all connect. This time even more so than What a Wonderful World, delivering on a more solid story overall. There's also stories that are more than a chapter, which is nice, including one that very much feels like a prototype for the ending of Punpun, but more so than that, it also sees Asano dabbling in darker topics like sexual abuse and one of his favorites, depression and death. Everything here feels a little bit darker, but it is honestly a step down from its predecessor, Nijigahara Holograph. This is where we see a lot of elements that will be used in Punpun starting to emerge, or at the very least starting to be used more predominantly. Again, a lot of the darker themes are present in this manga. These characters also feel a lot more empty and angry than any other so far. A lot of people die in Nijigahara Holograph and there's a lot of abuse happening throughout as well. If there is a message of hope in What a Wonderful World and City of Lights, in this one they are certainly a little bit more hidden, focusing more on the ugly side of humanity. This is not anything that isn't present in the other two, but this one feels particularly more resentful. This is also a far more cohesive storyline. While it follows a lot of characters and a lot of stories for what is essentially a volume-long manga, and there are two timelines to pay attention to, there is one singular story being told through the entire thing. But the other element that to me is very important to point out is how much Asano leans into the surrealism in this story. This is a story that from the get-go is not supposed to be fully understood with a single reading. The story is built to be quite confusing and doesn't really tell everything, but the confusion is also helped by the stories of the end of the world and monsters and weird tunnel, and of course the main theme of this manga, the butterflies. Asano can and will lean into surrealism even more than this, but this is definitely the first time since 2002 that a part of him is fully on display. But all of those elements are dialed down for City of Lights and then dialed back even more for 2005's Solenin. Now, I find Solenin to be quite interesting in Asano's career because we are getting closer and closer to Punpun, and as we discussed, Nijigahara Holographs feels the most like it, but we are actually moving away from that until the result is this manga. Solenin sees Asano in his most hopeful and funny yet. The story this time is finally moving away from connected one-shots and multiple main characters and stories to just the story of Meiko and her boyfriend. Now, Solenin isn't a happy story per se, but I feel like the topics are on one hand a little bit less heavy than the previous ones and honestly just a lot more effective in my point of view. It also sees Asano bringing a lot more lighthearted and not so lighthearted jokes into Solenin. This is still very much a story about being lost in life, but in a more grounded way, and it brings with that a much more relatable and inspiring story. That's why this is my favorite manga to reread and one of the ones I relate to the most out of every manga in general. It's simple, and it's straight to the point, and it really doesn't have any surreal elements to it. To me, this strips down a lot of the elements that Asano has been doing in the past 2 years and just straight up delivers on one perfect story in the vein of What a Wonderful World. After having finished that, and having what I think is this first big success, instead of doubling down on it, Asano puts this manga to the side and moves to a title that I think most of you never heard about, Goodnight Punpun. And it makes perfect sense for the manga to happen right here in his career. It just proved that he can do a more streamlined, longer story and that he can do it really well. So to explore what he can do with a full-fledged long series for the first time in his career now makes sense. Not only that, but Punpun grabs all the elements that Asano discarded in his previous work and just amps them up to their maximum. For this manga, Asano grabs everything that he's learned in his now 9-year-long career and does everything a little bit better. It's clear from interviews that Asano wanted to tap into the more dark and heavy themes and just deliver on something much more ruthless. To quote himself, "After I finished Solenin, when my editor started asking me what kind of manga I'd be doing next, what I always told him was that I was finished with feel-good stories." We're going to come back to this interview a couple times throughout the video, but here's the point. So far, there's always been a glimmer of hope, even if just a little, but with Punpun there's a conscious choice to not have that. Asano wants to make you uncomfortable. If you've read Punpun all the way through, you know that it delivers an aftertaste of sadness and bitterness, and this is very much what Asano wants to give to you. But for that to work its best, Punpun doesn't start as dark as it could. Asano's plans are to dabble in a simple romantic story, starting with a very obvious cliché as transfer student, and then dirty it throughout the story. And that's probably one of the reasons why he implements the character of Punpun. I think at first glance Punpun's design is the most glaring aspect of this manga. While every other character still looks like an Asano design, Punpun is presented like a picture book drawing. He feels completely off when compared to the rest of the manga. There's a clear contrast on his cute visuals and the bitter reality of who he will become and what kind of story this is. It would be hard to tell this is Asano from the introductory page of this manga if it wasn't for the backgrounds and his over-reliance on black panels with narration. A thing that is very much present in every manga of his to this point, a lot of them going forward, but that to me fits Punpun the most out of his repertoire. Why? Because Punpun is mute. Well, not really mute as he has conversation with people, but to us he is. His thoughts and lines are delivered to us as if narrated by someone else in these black panels, making Punpun feel even more like an innocent picture book character and not a manga one. It feels very much like Asano has built this trait specifically for this manga, but instead a look at his older manga shows that they are very present and generally used to deliver on monologues and inner thoughts of other main characters. But they don't work as well, and to a degree it kind of feels like Asano just probably doesn't know what to draw, while occasionally feeling like a good cinematic-esque ending of a scene. But this feeling like a novel breath of fresh air while still being virtually the same thing he's been doing at its core, it's a little detail that really shows that Asano is growing and using this manga to fully unlock every potential that he always had. But while the black panels are visually the same, we can say the same about everything else. Now again, it's still Asano, it looks like Asano, but it's in the little details that Punpun really differs. Character design wise, while I enjoy Asano's soft style, we have to admit that he reuses a lot of character designs across his manga, over and over and over again. And sure, those designs do pop in Punpun again, but between them there's a lot more variety, especially in terms of face structures. Not everyone has the same soft round face. A lot of these characters seem pushed to the boundaries of what people would realistically look like, while others are just a bit over it. Asano has done it before here and there for gags, but this is the first time we are seeing characters this distorted as proper character designs. And all around everyone feels a lot more expressive, more detailed, and seem to have a little bit more depth than ever before, though I feel like that's also because of the lighting. Light has been used pretty well across the board so far, probably one of Asano's best things art-wise, since the very beginning. And I'm not going to say that Punpun is far better, but it's at the very least a little bit darker just all around. Now, the lighting being good has a lot to do with this being digitally drawn, just like every single one of Asano's manga so far. But if Asano has used this to push his art a little bit further with the lightning, the sky, the backgrounds, and a bunch of realistic stuff, Goodnight Punpun sees Asano evolving this into some beautiful panels, but more importantly, some incredibly wacky imagery. I mean, there is a recurring character, the God, which is literally just a real-life face that pops every now and then. From laser beams to poop gods to Punpun's incredibly varied designs throughout the manga, Asano pushes the limits of what he can do within his own style. One last thing I want to point out is how Asano managed to put his structural approach to his early work into Punpun. Goodnight Punpun is like solid in the sense that it's a solid story following one main character throughout his story. There is one core main storyline going through this manga, but similar to mangaka like Naoki Urasawa, Asano is not afraid to pull his main character out of the story for a while and concentrate on other related characters. One example is his uncle, who gets a lot of focus throughout the story as we get to know him better. But a bit more detached from Punpun is his middle school classmates, who continue to get a story that keeps evolving throughout the years for far longer than they've been with Punpun. Even more detached is the entire storyline of Pegasus. Of course, everything comes together eventually, but this is essentially what Asano was doing with What a Wonderful World, but perfected for a longer series, and personally I love how well it works. But you know, the conclusion is that Goodnight Punpun is in many ways the conclusion of his style that he's been perfecting so far. And the outcome really shows that, not only in the story, but the results that Punpun ends up giving to him. With over 3 million sales, this is a manga that really pushed Asano into the mainstream, so to speak. It's hard to know how people feel about it in Japan, but at least in the West, this is probably one of the most talked about manga that has never gotten an anime adaptation of any kind, and one of the faces of seinen below the titans of Vagabond, Berserk, and Monster. And so, we are back to 2014. Kinda. Before we move on to Dead Demons, I do want to briefly talk about the 2 manga that Asano did during Goodnight Punpun. A Girl on the Shore probably doesn't need too much of a conversation dedicated to it, as it essentially sees Asano trying to do a shorter, more grounded story in the vein of Solani, but still clearly in the state of mind that he was for Punpun. But A Girl on the Shore isn't the only manga that Asano drew during Punpun. The other is probably his less well-known work, and one that I mentioned in the very beginning of this video, Ozanari-kun. Now, to contrast Goodnight Punpun, Ozanari-kun is Asano's least successful manga, and one look at it is enough to understand why. It's a gag manga in a style that, while it reminds me slightly of Punpun's own design, is still completely different from the Asano that we know. And inside these pages, is essentially just very surreal, incredibly nonsensical jokes that more often than not aren't as funny as they are confusing. This feels like Asano wanted to do what he used to do back in high school, but this time in a more professional setting with everything that he has learned so far as a mangaka. And that's fine. If anything else, it shows that Asano has the range to do something quite different from Goodnight Punpun and Solenni. But maybe because it wasn't successful, or just because it was just something that he wanted to put out at the time, he really doesn't return to this style. And so Ozanari-kun remains a solitary oddity in Asano's bibliography. And honestly, the first time I read it, I thought just that this was a weird detour on Asano's career, but in retrospect, Ozanari-kun is the bridge, the missing link between Goodnight Punpuns and Dead Demons. Now, I should note that this is by far my least favorite of his manga, but it's in the extreme way this manga runs from his usual style that we are able to see how he implements in a much more controlled way some of the new styles and approaches that we see moving forward. So now for real, 2014, and Asano needs to follow up its biggest success, and so he puts out Dead Demons, Dedededestruction! I want to put ourselves into the mindset of Inio Asano during that time. Thankfully, I don't have to guess or make hard assumptions because the same interview that I mentioned earlier has a lot of detail and of his thoughts process that led into Dead Demons. At this point, Asano could very easily follow up Punpun with something very similar to it. His 2017's Downfall comes to mind as something that fits very much with Punpun's style, tone, and themes. But 2014's Asano is a very different person than 2007's Asano. If in 2007 he wanted to stop with the feel-good stories, now he claims that he wants to make a manga that people can have fun reading. It's a big departure from what people who stayed with Asano through Punpun probably wanted from him. And this approach sees Asano strip Dead Demons out of some of his trademark tropes. The black panels that I mentioned before, gone. Completely gone. So hard he often see monologues about life and depression and society and everything. Those topics are still tackled during Dead Demons, but in much more digestible manner, like, shorter dialogues between people. Asano says that he didn't want to be as preachy as he had been up to this point. He mentions that he always hated this side of him that insisted in having these characters just essentially babble about the things he thought was right, but that he often felt so annoyed about people not understanding his views that he just couldn't avoid it. And he mentions that the turning point was an incident that I think is a lot of the reason for his departure in tone. The 2011's earthquake in Japan, which is the strongest in its recorded history, one of magnitude 9 that caused not only a huge tsunami but tens of thousands of deaths and completely destroyed entire coastline cities and towns. You may remember this earthquake as also being the one that caused an extreme danger of nuclear power stations to just explode. Thankfully, it didn't. And to me, through the whole event, as someone who was clearly detached and worried much more about my own personal life at the time, it always felt like the Japanese government was incredibly efficient in dealing with everything that happened. Much more so than I think ours will when I inevitably suffer through another great earthquake in Lisbon like it's predicted for the past 100 years. But Asano doesn't seem to see things that way, and that seems part of the reason the whole Pegasus character story even happens in Punpun in the first place, probably the most preachy character out of all of Asano's career. But it also seems like this event to a certain degree exhausted Asano. He no longer wants a Pegasus in his stories, nor he feels the need for a Punpun. Instead, he finds himself finding the beauty of fun manga, one that can give the reader some minutes of relaxation and on the other hand, be enjoyable to write for the mangaka. He also mentions one seinen manga being particularly influential, Dead Demons, one that I personally don't like too much, but one that is obvious. Keian. Yes, Keian influencing Asano in a manga of his seems like a straight up lie, but it's something you can notice pretty easily in this manga. This is a story about a bunch of girls hanging around. If it wasn't for the entire second plot of the series, this could easily be a cute girls doing cute things manga. Those cute things being mostly talking like someone whose brain has been destroyed by many years playing Call of Duty, but still cute somehow. Everything in here is a lot more lighthearted and a lot more comedic, and not even in the same sense that Punpun is with his dark humor, but just generally funny, cheerful moments. And a lot of chaotic ones. One of the main characters around being the main reason for this, but the entire main cast helps to have this feel that reminds me a lot of things like Toradoro and other simple cast manga and movies that focus a lot on these loud and random character interactions. One that I absolutely love, no secret there, it's always been one of my favorite things, and a great reason why I enjoy Toradoro, Chainsaw Man, Dan Dan Dan, and while different in execution, Dead Demons. It still has elements of Asano in there though, it's not a complete departure. This is still a story about characters who are lost in their lives, trying to find meaning, and sometimes talk about life and society, just not as often and not as in your face, at least not until later on, as his previous works. This fits perfectly as a gap between the seriousness of Punpun and the complete insanity of Ozanari-kun. And honestly, to me, this is a perfect balance, and one that I enjoyed from beginning to end. But this is not the only point where Demons makes a gap between Punpun and Ozanari-kun. Asano describes Ozanari-kun as being his most manga-like manga in his career, and while I do have some problems with that statement, I do understand what he means. All of his other works are filled with realism, story-wise and visually, but not only is Ozanari-kun just completely bonkers, it's also by far his most cartoony. While this isn't the style that Asano goes back to in Demons, you can definitely see its influence creeping up. There's a character that looks exactly like Ozanari's boss, for example, and it doesn't stop there. The character designs feel free from the style of early Asano, and we get to see a lot more stylized and wacky designs without being in that cartoony style. Characters with weird face structures, eyes that are completely different from anyone else's, and mouths that mix with the character's roles in ways that wouldn't feel right in his other manga. It really shouldn't work, but it does. And it helps this manga deliver on that feeling of fun and wackiness that Asano wants. To help this, there's also a detachment of digital art. Asano is trying to implement a lot more analog art into his manga, and the result is a lighter, softer style that could feel like a downgrade, but that honestly just works with the manga in question and feels much more honest and flawed than anything from Asano to this point. It also leads to an interesting contrast to Goodnight Punpun. In Goodnight Punpun, Asano's more wacky art contrasts with his more realistic style, while in Demons there's a couple of instances of more realistic imagery contrasting with the normal style of the manga. But one thing that I absolutely enjoyed in this manga is the other side of Demons. If half of this story is Asano's take on Kei-an, the other sees Asano's more political and serious side push a story completely out of everything that he has done so far, and a mystery to unravel that reminds me a lot of Naoki Urasawa's style, even if not as complex. You see, to contrast these cute girls doing their own thing, there's a huge spaceship just laying in the sky. One that feels threatening and dark, but that at the point where the story starts is already mundane to the characters. Now, while I do think the earthquake probably was some of the inspiration in the spaceship, everything feels much more like a metaphor for 9/11. There's this fascinating bit in the interview that I want to cite right now. Asano is questioned about the feeling of a calm before the storm feel in his manga, and the war that is portrayed in Demons, and he replies with this. The overall theme for the 2000s felt like stagnation, but it's obvious that at this point we've entered the end of the world. The world isn't going to end soon, it's already starting to end now. The question is how to live in an age where the whole world is spiraling down, down, down. The interviewer then asks, maybe your manga can be something that helps toughen the reader up so they can face that reality. To which Asano replies with, nah, I don't think so. I'm sure I don't have to explain 9/11 to any of you, but I do wonder how many of you actually remember it. I'm sure a good chunk of you are too young to even remember, or some of you probably even were born after it. Personally, I was almost 9 years old when it happened, so I was a bit too young to fully understand the ramifications of what was happening, but old enough to totally remember seeing the news live to this day. But more so than the immediate reaction to it, what stayed with me was how in the next following years, there was this aura of fear in, if not society, at least me. Especially after 2004, when another terrorist attack hit Spain, which is far closer to where I live, and that told me that this could happen anywhere. I was 11 at the time, and this fear that at any point my surroundings could just explode, war could just happen, and my loved ones could just die was terrifying. That, coupled with reading too many books about the horrors of climate change, made me with a pretty dark view of the future to come. One that hasn't changed. If anything, it got progressively worse, especially as we entered 2020. I can help but to feel that the world is ending and that there's not too much that we can do to save it. That's a fear that I've been carrying with me for the past 20 years, but that fear hasn't stopped me from living my life. It hasn't stopped me from being at least partially a functional human being. I'm not living in a constant state of fear and depression. No, slowly that fear and that realization just became mundane. Like the pandemic, it slowly just becomes there. We're still worried, we're still aware, we are still trying to take action, but we continue to live our lives nonetheless. Reading books, playing games, going out with friends, watching YouTube. Everything becomes mundane after a while. Even a spaceship floating in the sky. But it is in that mundanity that I feel that Demons completely contrasts every other Asano manga up to this point. His other works tend to be about mundane life. A lot of the time the stories told are stories that could have happened to anyone in real life. Sulny and Punpun are great examples. Punpun's life until the very last stretch is a normal life. It's a bit of a sad life, yes, but even then, once you start looking at things from the outside, Punpun doesn't really have the hardest life of all time. Instead, it's more so that everything in his life, for how mundane it is, feels bigger. A lot of Punpun's depression and the reason why he is like he is moving away and not meeting with a girl in elementary school. It feels like such a big thing while reading the manga, and for the character, the story, and to us, it's a moment of epic proportions. And that's something amazing, that Asano can truly make us feel and make us care for these moments. That Asano can take these mundane life events and make one of the best manga ever out of it. But Demons is the complete opposite of that. There's a war, there's aliens, there's a disease, but it all feels mundane, it feels unimportant. Instead, we focus on girls going on dates, having lunch with friends, and being way into video games. And none of these actions ever feel as big as they would in Punpun. No, instead, they feel small, mundane, simple, and that's something I love about this manga. Asano wanted to write the end of the world for a while. It's a topic that is referenced in so many of his manga, especially so on Goodnight Punpun. It's never true though, just something people say because it feels like the end of the world. With Demons, he literally tells us the world is ending, and there we are, watching YouTube videos. I'm curious to see how he evolves from now on. I think his most recent one-shots have been tackling weirder and more unique approaches to his style, from Bakemono Red-chan to Heroes. Heroes specifically merging more fantasy and shonen elements to his dark humor to bring a very unique manga. But his next work seems to be a collaboration where he's not going to be in charge of the story. And while it kinda sucks not have Asano's writing style in it, I do think it'll be pretty good for him to be given a chance to draw things and stories that he normally wouldn't. So I'm excited for his future. Unless, of course, the world ends before that. But before the world ends, you really should check out my channel if you like manga. And if you're still here and you haven't subscribed, consider taking that action because this video took a while to make. And if you watched it till here, thank you very much, and I'll see you next video.